Allow me to explain before we begin. Simply put, life doesn't always unfold the way we expect it to. You don't always meet the people you expect to come into your life, do you? You follow the rules set by society and sometimes your own personal rules, only to find yourself swept up in emotions, and that's exactly what I wasn't prepared for. When I think back to it, I can finally see what happened to me. I'm not proud of it, but in a way, it helped shape the person I've become. I had no idea how a single decision could set off a chain of events. Secrets, confusion, and guilt, as well as the decision to make things even more complicated. With someone I knew, I'll never openly admit my feelings for my younger brother, but please let me explain before you draw conclusions to provide some context. I grew up in a family that wasn't particularly close. Yes, we were polite to each other, but there was a noticeable lack of warmth. My brother Jim was 5 years younger than me for most of my life. We existed in completely different worlds. When he was still in high school, he was absorbed in his studies and social life, while I was off at college. He was just beginning to enter his teenage years when I left. But when I returned, everything had changed. My awkward teenage years were behind me, and I could sense a shift in Jim. He wasn't the shy, awkward child I remembered. He had suddenly grown up. He was no longer just my little brother. He was now intelligent, kind, and surprisingly charming. Initially, I believed I was hallucinating, but my attraction to him became irresistible. I had practically raised him, so how could I feel this way? Yet the feeling was undeniable. One evening, we were sitting in the backyard under the stars, feeling completely at ease with one another. It started as a simple conversation. We reminisced about our childhood, teasing each other over the silly things we used to do. And however, Jim's statement abruptly halted me. "You know, I've always looked up to you," Jim said softly, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "But lately, I feel like I see you differently." I couldn't think of anything to say. My heart started racing, but it wasn't the kind of racing I had ever experienced before. Instead of laughing nervously and changing the subject, his words lingered in the air, heavy and full of meaning between us. That night appeared innocent enough, yet it unlocked a door I couldn't shut. His words lingered between us, and in the weeks that followed, everything started to feel more complicated. I began to realize that I was feeling emotions I had no business feeling after that night under the stars. I tried to convince myself that Jim's words meant nothing, that he was just being sentimental, maybe even a little nostalgic. However, the feeling persisted. He gazed at me as if I were more than just his older sister, causing my heart to flutter. I tried to distract myself with the busy rhythm of daily life, jobs, applications, friends, anything to keep my mind occupied. But Jim, too, seemed determined to stay close. He found ways to be near me, coming into my room to talk about his day, lingering as I cooked in the kitchen, spending time with me in ways that felt increasingly intimate. We spent hours together watching TV, and before long, I could no longer tell if it was just the comfort of family or something more. At first, I convinced myself that I was overthinking it. Families are supposed to be close, right? But it wasn't just closeness I was feeling. There was an undeniable tension, a silent pull that seemed to exist between us. I was too scared to acknowledge it, too vulnerable to confront the truth of what was happening then. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, when the rain poured relentlessly outside, we found ourselves stuck inside the storm, kept us trapped indoors, restless and bored. That's when Jim suggested we play a card game, just like we used to when we were children. "You have no chance," I teased, trying to keep things light. "See about that," He replied with a smile as we joked and laughed, but as we continued, I began to feel something different every time his hand brushed against mine as he passed. Every card he played felt intentional. I noticed his gaze lingering just a little too long. My heart was pounding, but not because of the game. At one point, as I reached across the table to grab the deck, our hands brushed. It was a simple tea, but it felt electric. We frozen, as did he. We locked eyes, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to pause. The world seemed to vanish around us. "Do you feel it too?" he asked quietly. I didn't know how to respond. Denying it would feel like lying, but admitting it would change everything. "I'm not sure what you mean," I whispered, pulling my hand back. Quickly standing up, Jim wasn't going to let it go. He followed me into the living room, his expression serious. "Don't do that," he warned. "Don't pretend this isn't happening. It's not right. We can't," I blurted out. "This isn't us. We can't feel this way." "Why not?" he challenged, his voice low and intense. "What's wrong with feeling like this? We understand what we're supposed to be, but I can't help how I feel. And I'm not thinking about it." I didn't have an answer. I just knew that I felt like I was being pulled in two directions, and no matter which way I went, someone would be hurt. I told Jim that we couldn't talk about it anymore, but the damage had already been done. The lines had blurred. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't unreel what I was feeling. Things got more complicated between Jim and me. We never spoke directly about what had happened, but it was all always there, simmering beneath the surface. Every look, every word, every moment we shared felt charged with something we couldn't name. We were dancing around something that neither of us could allow ourselves to act on. I tried to pretend things were normal, but normal wasn't an option anymore. If I spent too much time with Jim, I felt like I would lose myself completely. Every interaction with him felt like walking a tightrope, and I was terrified of falling. It felt as though the more I tried to avoid him, the more I was ripping apart a piece of myself, and the hardest part, he wasn't, making it easy for me to keep my distance. Jim began to find ways to be closer to me. He offered to spend more time together, helped me with errands, and suggested we watch movies or just relax in my room. The worst part was that I wanted him there. I wanted to be close to him, even though I knew I couldn't allow it. One evening, we were watching a movie together in the living room. The atmosphere felt almost romantic. We barely paid attention to the drama on screen, the dim lighting, and the rain outside providing a quiet, intimate backdrop. I can't remember what the scene was about, but at one point I rested my head on Jim's shoulder, even though it was a small, innocent gesture. It felt like a boundary had been crossed. He stayed still, and the tension between us was palpable, even though neither of us said a word. "You're really creating this atmosphere, aren't you?" he finally asked. He finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, pretending ignorance, though I knew exactly what he was referring to too. "I mean this," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "There's no us, Jim," I said firmly. "Why can't there be?" His voice was full of longing, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. I stood up, my heart racing. "Does it feel like I'm missing something?" he asked, but instead of answering, I mumbled something about being tired and started heading to my room, hoping that would be the end of the night. But I was wrong. Later, there was a knock on my door. "Jim, I'm really not in the mood right now," I said, hoping he would leave me alone. "It's important," he interrupted, his voice firm. I hesitated before opening the door. Jim stepped inside and gently closed it behind him. For a moment, we just stood there, silent, unsure of what to say or do next between us. There was heaviness in the air. "I don't care what anyone else thinks," he said, looking directly at me. "I'm interested in what you think, what you feel, Jim." "I can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. It's not right. There are consequences for us, our family, our lives, everything we have. It's not fair. Doesn't matter, he said, moving closer. I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm just asking you to be honest. How do you feel? His question lingered in the air, and I wasn't prepared to answer. I wasn't prepared to face what admitting the truth would mean. Everything would change. There would be no turning back. But how long could I keep going, pretending I didn't feel this way? In my mind, and I froze, caught between the weight of my feelings and the burden of knowing what was at stake. My heart was racing, and my mind screamed at me to say no, to end this before it went any further, but I couldn't. I can't. I started, my voice trembling. I don't know what this is. That's not an answer, he said softly, his eyes searching mine, as though trying to read the truth. I was too scared to say. In that moment, I felt completely exposed. I felt it in every moment we spent together. Every glance, every word. We were different now. But how could I admit it? How could I acknowledge something that felt so wrong? Something that could destroy everything we knew. I can't do this, I whispered, looking away. You're already there, he replied, his voice soft but intense. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned away, desperate to create space between us. But I could feel him moving closer, closing the gap. Please, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Please be honest with me. I need to know. I'm not crazy. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him he was mistaken and that this was all in his head. But nothing came to me. The silence stretched between us, deafening in that moment. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that I did feel what I felt, whatever this is. It can't happen not like this, I finally said, my voice barely audible. Jim didn't argue. He nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of understanding and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I'm not going to push you, he said quietly, but I am here. I think you know how I feel. He left me alone, and the following few days passed quickly. I threw myself into work, anything that could keep me occupied and distracted, but no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about Jim. He wasn't giving me much space. He kept appearing in small moments, bringing me coffee in the mornings, casually sitting next to me at dinner. He would brush against me as he passed by. Every interaction seemed like a test, and he waited for me to say something, to do something, to break. One evening, I found a small notebook on the coffee table. At first, I thought it was mine, but when I opened it, I realized it was Jim's. The journal was full of sketches and notes, little bits of poetry I never knew he wrote, but what caught my attention was a page near the back. It wasn't labeled, but as I read it, my heart started to race. He'd written about me, how he saw me as more than just his sister, how he admired me in a way that went beyond family. He couldn't stop wondering what it was between us, as the words were brutally honest, and it terrified me. I knew I shouldn't have read it, but I couldn't stop. Each word felt like a pull, deeper into a situation I wasn't ready to face. Slowly, I put the journal down and walked away. The weight of what I had read hung heavy in the air there, but I didn't know how to escape it. I should have walked away from the journal, but I couldn't. Everything changed. It wasn't just that I no longer had feelings for him. It was genuine, written in ink. It was impossible to ignore, and the more I tried to resist it, the worse it felt. I was losing control. Exactly what he would say. The words in that journal were everything I had been avoiding. It wasn't just about admiration or the bond between siblings. There was a longing for something deeper, a closeness, a love. As much as I didn't want to admit it, those feelings mirrored my own. The next morning, all the emotions I'd been suppressing for weeks surfaced. I avoided him entirely. I couldn't face him, not after what I had read. Jim wasn't someone you could avoid for long. By evening, he found me sitting in the backyard, staring blankly at the horizon. "You've been silent all day," he said, sitting down next to me. "Just thinking," I responded, trying to sound casual. "What about?" he asked, his tone light. Though I could sense the underlying tension, I hesitated, cautious, but curious. My fingers nervously picked at the edge of my sleeve. "I found your journal inside my sweater," I admitted, not daring to look at him for a moment. There was a silence before I heard him exhale sharply. "I didn't intend for you to see it," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure what to do with what I had read, or how to handle the request that he had made. My voice trembled slightly as I spoke. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." He turned to face me. Then his expression, a mix of fear and hope. "It broke my heart. I didn't want to make things harder for you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But I can't pretend not to feel what I do. I tried, but it's impossible. I don't know if I can do this." "Jim," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's too much, too complicated." "It doesn't have to be," he said, his voice steady. "We don't need to figure it all out right now. I just need to know how you feel. Do you feel the same way I do?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him that everything had been a mistake and that we could undo it all, but I couldn't lie anymore. "I can't lie anymore," I whispered, barely able to form the words. But it was true. Admitting it set off a chain reaction. I couldn't stop in the subsequent weeks. Jim and I navigated our emotions. We never strayed from our feelings, but we also never completely detached ourselves from them. Every conversation, every shared moment felt like walking a tight RPP, one wrong move away from falling. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late and the rest of the house was asleep. I was in the kitchen, unable to sleep, when Jim walked in. "Can't sleep?" he asked, taking a glass of water. I couldn't meet his gaze. "No," I said softly, avoiding his eyes. We exchanged a brief glance, but neither of us said anything. He placed the glass down and turned toward me. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice serious. "I know," I replied, even though I already knew what he was going to say about us. He nodded, gesturing between us. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I need to know where we stand." "I don't know," I said. "I don't know whether do, Jim. Every part of me is telling me this is wrong, but I can't stop feeling what I feel." "Then stop fighting it," he said, stepping closer. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's too much. It's too dangerous." "Then let me make it simple," he said, his voice steady. "Do you want me to walk away? Because if that's what you need, I'll do it. I'll walk away. And while this might be forgivable, I'll never bring this up again, but if you want me to stay..." Jim's ultimatum left me speechless. He was offering me a way out, but was it really what I wanted? I had to make a decision. And I knew that whatever I chose, there would be no going back. Jim's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He stood there waiting for my answer. His eyes locked on mine. The sensation of a vice gripped my heart. This was the crucial moment when everything would shift. either positively or negatively. Jim, I began, my voice shaking. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how we can make this work without destroying everything. His expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. I'm not asking for everything to be figured out right now, he said. I'm just asking you to choose. Do you want me to stay or not? Tears welled up in my eyes. I wanted to say no, to tell him to walk away so we could pretend this never happened. But the truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. I don't want you to go, I whispered for a moment. He looked as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Without saying another word, he stepped closer and wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't romantic or suggestive, it was just comfort, safety, and understanding. We'll figure it out, he said softly. The days passed quietly, one step at a time. What followed was a strange mix of relief and fear. Jim and I became more cautious around others, hyper aware of how our interactions might be perceived. At the same time, we sought out moments where we could speak freely without the weight of secrecy crushing us. But peace did not last long. Secrets have a way of coming to light, and ours was no exception. As Jim and I were speaking quietly in the backyard, Olivia, our older cousin, walked out onto the porch unexpectedly. We both looked startled, having no idea how much she had overheard. What's going on here? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Olivia wasn't stupid, even if she sometimes acted too quickly. She looked at both of us, her gaze sharp and probing. You two have been acting strange for weeks. Don't tell me it's nothing. Jim started to say something, but I quickly cut him off. We've just been spending more time together, I said, trying to sound casual. Yeah, and Olivia replied, her tone skeptical. That's what's weird. You two were never this close before. What changed? I felt panic rising in my chest. Olivia was the last person we wanted to suspect anything. She was blunt, observant, and had no problem calling people out. Nothing changed, I said, forcing a laugh. We're just getting along better these days. Olivia didn't look convinced, but she dropped the subject for the moment. Later that night, I sat in my room, the tension between us palpable. I whispered, she knows something's up. Handle it, Jim replied. I could feel my voice breaking as I spoke. This is already hard enough without someone sniffing around. What if she figures it out? What if she tells someone? We'll figure it out, Jim said firmly. But I'm not walking away just because things are getting difficult. His determination was comforting, but it didn't erase the fear gnawing at me. Olivia wasn't someone who let things go, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she started asking questions again. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I could feel the weight of our secret pressing down harder than ever. Jim and I had made our choice, but could we survive the consequences for